Hello, hello. Good morning, everyone. Susan Brennan here with Growth and Grace for our weekly episode. And this morning, y'all are going to get to hear a little bit about what this last couple weeks have been like. So you may have noticed, maybe not. If not, no worries. There was not a Growth and Grace happening last week. And we're back. We're good. Last week was a little bit interesting in the world of Susan. So for the sake of this setup and the fact that this is like a quicker show and we don't have hours to get into everything, long story short, there have been a couple different arenas of life where I've had the opportunity to show up vulnerably. And I want to talk through that because that can be really like, oh my gosh, what do you do? Like you kind of feel like you want to protect yourself. Your throat wants to close up. You're like, do I say this? Do I share this? Oh my gosh. And the cool thing is you have a choice every time. Like every time we're in a conversation, for me specifically, it was 2 separate conversations. And every time we're in a conversation, we have the opportunity to either show up and be vulnerable and be real and raw and like share where you're at, or we can choose to, not do that, for lack of better words, and pretend that everything's hunky-dory and everything's great. Or, you could acknowledge that something's wrong, but you don't want to talk about it. And I'm sure there's some other ways you could handle it. Those are kind of my go-tos, if you will. Kind of the ones that I typically would select from. And what's been interesting in these last couple weeks is in these conversations, there have been, they've been long conversations. They've been extended hours of talking, which I'm really good with, but when you're emotionally exposing yourself, it gets kind of exhausting. And what's really interesting is that these that looks like 4. These 2 conversations, what was really interesting to me was how different, there were 2 different people, 2 totally different scenarios, etc. But what's interesting is that they were completely different experiences as far as how I felt being vulnerable, because in one scenario, I felt seen and I felt heard and I felt like the person genuinely wanted to connect on it and walk through it with me. And so the space felt very safe to be vulnerable. And in the other scenario, I felt like each time I was being vulnerable, throughout the whole conversation, it was just being knocked away and not heard and not seen. And it's so fascinating now that I'm outside of the scenario. In the moment, it was so irritating and frustrating and oh my gosh, yeah, I want to hang up. I didn't, because I wanted to get through the conversation, but wow, you've had that where you're just I just want to be done. This is not working for me. And what's so fascinating now that I can look back at the conversations and see how I was, what was viscerally happening within my body. And it's so important for us to tune into that, because it would be really easy for us to kind of come up with a dialogue, come up with points, A, B, C, I'm just going to say it, deliver it, and then kind of walls up, I'm closing myself off from the rest of the conversation. Even if you stay in it, you're not really in it. That's definitely an option I've taken in the past. I just need to make sure that I say what I want to say, and then I'm out. And it's really interesting when you tune in to how your body is actually feeling, on a physical level, what is happening. And use that as guidance for who you're, honestly, partly for who you're spending time with. When you get that creepy vibe from someone, or that yeah, I can't trust this person. I like them, I enjoy them, but I'm not telling them anything important because I don't trust that it'll stay secret. Like you kind of just feel things like there's something off here, or like you get that vibe that I should get out of here, like this, there's just something not right here. Listen to that. Like that, our intuition is really strong and we've learned to stifle it. And your body is really good at telling you what it needs. And if you've ever experienced like burnout, or your body just all of a sudden crashes, like that's a clue that something needs to change. And it's your body telling you, like, knock it off, change something. And we get to also use that in conversations. So what's fascinating is I'm looking back and I'm remembering, like, in one conversation, I was like so frustrated and so like closed off, and like just like, every part of me just felt like tense and like, oh, this is not working. This is so irritating. And in the other conversation, I remember actually being able to feel like I could feel my heart racing, because it was a very vulnerable conversation. And there was, you know, the thoughts are swirling through your head, of course. And lots of the thoughts are like, you know what, don't share that. Like, that's scary to share that with someone, because that means that, like, it's an exchange of trust, right? So it's acknowledging, I trust you enough to share this with you. And I trust you enough to stumble my way through it, because it's not something I've really vocalized before. And that's for me. And I'm a very trusting person. Like I'm typically I'll trust you until you show me that I shouldn't. Typically type person, and I trust my intuition. But it's like really, when you can really tune in and recognize, like, wow, even though I feel my heart racing, even though I'm like, oh, this is really big to share, I still can feel that I'm like relaxed, and that I'm able to take the time to be intentional with what I want to say. I don't feel rushed. I don't feel like, oh my gosh, hurry, 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 get this over with. And like, you know, shoulders up and like clenched fists and like tight jaw. And so I say all of this, and now to kind of bring it back to the topic of showing up vulnerably, even when you're feeling hurt, because admittedly, the first conversation I had earlier last week was like really hurtful feeling for me. And it's taken time to continue processing through that. And I could have let that knock me off my vulnerability train. I don't even know what we want to call that. I could have let it like knock me by the wayside. And I could have said, you know what, I'm out. Like, I had a vulnerable conversation earlier this week. It did not go how I was hoping it would go. It didn't go well. Like, it felt really painful. You know, I didn't feel seen. I didn't feel heard, like all the things. And I could have chosen to not move forward in vulnerability again because of how that happened in the past. And thankfully, I had actually, not last week, but the week before, just been having like a really deep dive conversation with a girlfriend around vulnerability and around like specifically choosing that, because it is a choice. It doesn't just happen. You don't just like, oh, I'm just going to be vulnerable. Like when you're in a moment like that where you feel your emotions coming up, or you feel your heart pounding, or you feel like, oh my gosh, can I say this? When you're in that moment, like you get to make a very conscious choice to choose vulnerability. And so here's one of the things that I did that I have found really helpful. I've done this many times in conversations, is to actually call it out. Like in the conversation, I will say something like this. This is what I said in the second conversation. I said, you know, this feels really vulnerable for me to share. And just saying it out loud helps diffuse it. Just saying that helps you to acknowledge it is a vulnerable thing to share. It also helps the other person recognize, like, I'm about to share something vulnerable with you. And while this person in particular already was doing an amazing job of holding like a very safe space and being in the conversation with me, really present, really caring, it allowed to just, it can help someone if they aren't in that situation. It can help someone, like, sort of one of those social cues, you know, probably not an appropriate time to crack a joke. Like, this is going to be a lot of energy output for me to share this, because it's so raw, and you feel very exposed when you're being vulnerable, because you are sharing things that maybe you normally don't share, or you're sharing like thoughts that you haven't verbalized before, and so it might get a little messy as you're kind of processing your way through them. Like, there's a lot of things that can be vulnerable in a conversation, and what I want to encourage you in is, as you're stepping into conversations, like, each one is a fresh conversation. Each person you're speaking to is a fresh opportunity to choose vulnerability. And what's so beautiful about this second conversation I had this last week was knowing that, like, it even further deepened that friendship, to be able to go there and to be able to receive. And there was vulnerability on both sides, absolutely. But it was because we both chose to show up vulnerably, even though there had been pain in our past. Like, both of us have been screwed over, and both of us have had, you know, people break trust. And like, there were all these reasons why both of us could have said, you know what, I'm going to not share what I really want to share, because I could get hurt. And the fact is, you could get hurt. Like, that conversation went great, and it deepened our trust. And the conversation I'd had earlier in the week did not go so great, and the trust felt even more broken. So it's like, you can't decide how the other person is going to show up, but you can choose for yourself how you want to show up. And so I encourage vulnerability. I also, and I feel like I touch on this on several of my Facebook Lives, but it's a very real thing. And going back to the intuition, trust that if you're feeling that, like, I just don't know about this person. Like, I don't know that like, if it's a creepy vibe, or if it's I can't trust them vibe, or whatever it is, no. Oh my goodness, excuse me. On and on and on. Come on, wrap it up, Susan. Like, know that there's a reason that your body is viscerally responding in that moment. And it's okay to choose to not share. Like, how do I want to say this? Because I don't want you to close yourself off. I want you to find safe people to share things with. And I want you to practice these kinds of conversations with people who aren't judgy, with people who will love you regardless of what comes up, with people who can hold that safe space so you can actually process through. And for some people, and there's zero judgment, I have done this myself, for some people it's a therapist or a counselor or someone who can, like, professionally walk you through that. And there's zero judgment with that. It's incredibly helpful to have someone to talk through things with. And if you don't have a friend in your life, and I've totally been at spots in my life where I didn't have someone that I felt like I could do that with. It was my own stuff. Like, I was totally isolating and closing myself off, but like, I didn't feel like I had friends that I could talk with. So I went to go see a counselor just to process through things, because the things needed to still be processed. So I say all of that because I want you to choose, like, be in tune with what's going to support, and choose to have these conversations with people who are going to, my little wrap it up alarm, choose to have the conversation with people who can actually support you through it. And if you feel like, you know, the person, I feel like I'm getting into a totally new topic here, but long and short of it, how to show up vulnerably, even when you're feeling hurt, is a choice. And you, in addition to choosing to be vulnerable or not, you get to choose who you fully open up to and who you don't. And I think sometimes when we so want to process through something, or we so want to express how we're feeling or be heard, sometimes we forget to also be wise with who we choose to process with. So take a step, take a moment, like tune in and get clear on what you want to communicate. And I'm a bullet point person. It's helpful for me to be like, okay, I want to make sure I address this, this, and this. Write it down. There's no shame in that. Like, let yourself be clear on what you want to communicate through, because let me tell you, it is beautiful when you get into that vulnerable space. It's really nice to be able to like go through everything while you're in that space that's been created. So with all of that, in addition to choosing to be vulnerable, you can choose who you have, like exposing. Vulnerability is emotionally exposing yourself. Choose who you have those conversations with. And you know, you can grow as you continue practicing the conversations. They'll continue going deeper. You'll continue navigating them smoother. And just remember that if it starts feeling like, can I even say this? But you know you're with a trusted person, you can lead it by saying, okay, you know, what I'm about to share feels really vulnerable for me. And then you can share it. Like, let yourself help create that atmosphere and be the person for other people. Like, allow yourself to be a safe person for other people to be able to share with. It creates beautifully deep friendships and relationships when you can be a safe haven for people. So it doesn't mean you're their savior. It means you're a safe person for them to come to. Yeah, I'm leaving you with that nugget because that's a very key difference. So with that, y'all, I'm going to sign off. I'm heading into women's prayer for the day, and I will see you next Thursday, 6 a.m. Pacific, 9 a.m. Eastern. And until then, have a beautiful day. Bye for now.